Okay, everyone, let's get started. So as you can see, I've underlined my back panty pieces with my swimwear lining, not with power mesh. I have sewn the center back seam and pressed it open. Now let's take a look at the front panty. I've also underlined this one, but for this one I have used the power mesh for a little more control on the front. And the first thing we're going to do is just sew these together at the side seams. So place the two pieces right sides together, pin at the side seams, and then we're going to sew them together using a zigzag stitch. All right, now that I have finished sewing my side seams, I am going to press them open. And it's not a bad idea to use a ham here, just to have a nice raised surface, and also because there's a bit of a curve to the side seam. So go ahead and press those open. The next thing we're going to do is apply the leg elastic. So if you sewed the Skipper bodysuit or watched that video, you'll understand this process already. We're going to cut 2 lengths of elastic for the legs, and you're going to want to refer to the instructions. There's a chart in there telling you how long your elastic should be for your size. You're going to need 2 lengths of that elastic, and this should be the 3/8 of an inch wide swimwear elastic. Now we need to divide the elastic in half to find the halfway point, and you can put a pin marker. And now we're going to pin the elastic to the panty leg itself, to the wrong side. So you should be seeing the lining / power mesh side when you look at it. All right, so go ahead and pin the elastic to one end of the crotch, aligning the edge of the elastic with the raw edge of the leg of the panty. So pin the front and then pin the end of the elastic to the back crotch, and then match the pin mark on your elastic to the side seam. And you'll notice that the elastic is going to be smaller than the panty leg itself, which is what we want. We're going to be stretching the elastic to fit the panty leg. Put your machine on a nice wide zigzag, so you can go as wide as 4 millimeters long. As wide as 4 millimeters wide. And you can also have this stitch be a little bit long. I think of this step as basting almost. So we're zigzag basting the elastic to the panty leg. So stretch the elastic as you're sewing so that it fits the panty leg, and just zigzag right down the center of the elastic itself. Okay, now we're going to turn the elastic to the inside of the panty. So just flip it right in, and now we're going to sew from the wrong side using a narrower zigzag. So 2.5 by 2.5 is fine. And you're going to want to orient the zigzag so that it kind of stitches one half of the zigzag off the elastic and then one half on. So you're stitching that elastic down permanently. And this is going to give us a nice, neat finish from the outside. And just as a tip, your zigzag stitching should be about 3/8 of an inch from the folded edge of the elastic. And now you're going to repeat the whole process on the other leg. Next thing we need to do is sew the crotch seam. So match the two sides of the crotch, trim away any underlining that doesn't match if you need to, and make sure that the folded in edges of the elastic match each other at the 5/8 of an inch sewing line. And now we're going to sew these together at 5/8 of an inch. You can use your narrow zigzag here. Don't forget to backstitch on each end. And now what we're going to do for a nice clean finish, and so that you don't have those annoying seam allowances right in your crotch, we're going to top stitch those down. Okay, so just finger press them open, and then we're going to stitch them in place to either side of the seam line at 1/4 inch. And now we're going to trim away these seam allowances for a nice, neat finish on the inside. So just use a nice pair of sharp scissors. Small scissors are great for this. Trim away those seam allowances close to your stitching. And voila, your panty is done. So what you can do now is either sew it onto your swimsuit at the waistline seam, or if you want to add the skirt, go to the skirt portion of the video, sew that, and then you'll baste it together to the panty at the waistline. Okay everyone, let's sew our skirts. So as you can see, I've already constructed quite a bit of it. I have sewn the center back seam, pressed it open, and then I have also sewn the front to the back at the side seams and pressed those open as well. And I used a narrow zigzag for stitching those side seams. Now we're going to hem the skirt. So I highly recommend pressing your hem before sewing it. Spandex can be a little tricky to hem, and I feel like pressing it helps keep it in place and avoid any disappointments in the hemming process. So turn it up 5/8 of an inch to the wrong side and press it in place. So we're going to go all the way around the bottom of the skirt in this way. Right, and now that you've pressed it up, you can pin it in place if you like, or just try to keep it the way that you pressed it as you're sewing. But pinning works too if you prefer to use pins. So now we're going to top stitch it using a narrow zigzag. So by narrow, I mean about 1.5 millimeters wide by 2.5 to 3 long on your zigzag. And I'm top stitching at 1/2 inch. And what I really want to stress is that you just want to keep all the layers nice and smooth here to avoid a ripply hem. And one of the best features you can look for on a sewing machine, and hopefully you have this, is the adjustable presser foot pressure. Putting it to a low setting really helps avoid ripples on hems on things like spandex, because the presser foot isn't pushing the spandex against the feed dogs too much, giving you those ripples. So it helps to go to a low setting on your presser foot pressure. The other thing you can do if you don't have that is to invest in a walking foot, because that will help the two layers feed through your machine evenly. Once you finish your top stitching, I really recommend that you give your hem a nice press. If you see ripples, getting rid of them might be just a matter of a nice steam press. So press your hem from the right side using just a little bit of steam, and don't hold the iron in any one place for too long to avoid melting or damaging your fabric. Okay, there's your finished skirt. So now we're going to put this together with the panty underneath it. So put the panty inside the skirt with the right side of the panty facing the wrong side of the skirt, and match them up at the seam allowances and at the notches, and just pin all the way around. Okay, let's baste these layers together. You can use a narrow zigzag again for this, and you're going to baste all the way around, joining those two layers, and make sure to pivot at the center front and center back V points. Okay, now that you're finished basting, we have a beautiful, complete skirt panty unit that is ready to be sewn to your swimsuit bodice. All right, everyone, you can see I've completed a few steps on my bloomer already. I've underlined it with the swimwear lining. I've sewn my center front and center back seams, as well as my side seams and my crotch seam. So what we're going to go over in this little video is the gathering as well as the elastic casing for the legs. So I have already sewn my gathering stitches in 4 separate segments. So each quadrant of the bloomer should have its own set of gathering stitches. Gathering layers of spandex can be a little tricky, so we divided it up into 4 easily manageable segments for you. So I'm going to do one segment at a time, pulling up my gathering stitches. So pull those bobbin threads to create gathers in each of those 4 segments. And for now, just gather them up so that they visually look like a gathered bloomer. So you're just kind of eyeballing it for now. And then you'll distribute the gathers when you actually attach the bloomer to the swimsuit bodice in an upcoming step. Okay, so now I have a very cute looking bloomer with a gathered top, and now we need to address this leg situation. So I have already sewn the casing on one side, and I'm going to show you how to do it on the other one. So you're going to turn in the leg raw edge 1/2 inch. Turn it in and press it first. This is going to help you get a nice smooth line of stitching in the next step. I also like to pin this little hem allowance or casing allowance in place before I stitch it. I feel like it just helps me keep everything nice and smooth when I'm top stitching it in the next step. And remember that we're going to be leaving an opening for threading the elastic through the casing. So I've given myself a little pin mark to remind myself. And now we're going to top stitch the casing, and you can use a straight stitch here because the stitches themselves don't need to be able to stretch here, just the elastic is stretching. So you're going to sew this at 3/8 of an inch. We are top stitching. And make sure that all your layers stay in place the way you pin them. And make sure that you're catching the seam allowance underneath to create your elastic casing. And we're going to stitch all the way around the leg opening, and just remember to leave yourself at least an inch opening at the crotch to thread your elastic through the casing. And here you can see my top stitched leg opening, ready for the elastic to be inserted into that casing. The next thing we're going to do is cut our lengths of elastic for the leg opening. So make sure that you consult the chart inside the instructions to get the correct length for your size. You're going to attach a small safety pin to one end of the elastic, and we're just going to start threading it through that casing where you left your opening. So just continue smushing that little safety pin through the casing all the way around this leg opening. And just be careful not to completely pull the other end of the elastic through and lose your end. So it's a good idea to put, a couple pins through that end just so that you don't lose it. And just continue threading. This process can take a little while, and sometimes you get caught in the seam allowances. It's not the end of the world if you have to open up your casing at those seam allowances and thread it through, and then go back after the elastic is threaded through and just close up your stitching where you had to open it up, okay? So just know you can fix it if you run into that problem. I know it's a little tricky in this fabric. Once you have the elastic in, you can kind of scrunch the casing around it to distribute the gathers that you've now created. And you're also going to take those two ends of your elastic, remove the safety pin and your little warning pins that you put in there, and overlap them by 1/2 inch. And make sure that you don't have any twists in your elastic before you do this. And you're going to pin that overlap together. And now you need to pull out the elastic again. I know it's counterintuitive because we just spent so long getting the elastic in there, but you do need a little bit of room to work with here so that we can stitch these two ends of the elastic shut. So you're going to use a zigzag stitch, 2.5 wide by 2.5 long is fine. And we're going to stitch right on that elastic and go back and forth several times to really secure it so that your bloomer doesn't snap in the leg while you're wearing it. Okay, now that your elastic ends are secure, you can redistribute the gathers around the elastic casing, and we are going to stitch that opening shut. Okay, so where you inserted the elastic, you're going to pin it in place, and we're just going to top stitch it shut, joining your stitching with the previous stitching that you did on the casing. And now your casing is shut and your elastic channel is completely sewn and you have a finished bloomer leg. Okay, everyone, let's sew this Patreon exclusive ruched side bottom. You can see I've already constructed a lot of this. I'm going to show you how I got to this point, but here's what I've done. I have underlined my back panels with my swimwear lining, sewn my center back seam. I have also underlined my front panel with that power mesh. And here's what your beautiful ruched side panel is going to look like. So I've already gotten there on one side, and I'm going to show you how I got there with that ruched side panel. So you have two pieces here. You have the ruched panel, and then you also have the ruched panel stay. All right, so one is considerably longer than the other because it's going to get gathered to fit. And the stay is what controls those gathers to give them a beautifully finished look when you wear the suit. So what we need to do is do gathering stitches, so a double row of gathering stitches on both long vertical sides of the ruched panel. So on the longer side, you are going to start at the top with your gathering stitches, and you're going to finish at the circle mark on the pattern. So set your machine to a long straight stitch, so 4 to 5 millimeters long, and do your first row of gathering stitches at 1/2 inch. And sew all the way down to the circle. And make sure that you leave yourself some nice long tails so that you can pull your gathering stitches up in the next step. Now your next row of gathering stitches is right next to your first one at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Don't backstitch. All right, and again, give yourself a couple inches of tails. And then we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So this is the shorter vertical side of that piece. And here there's no circle mark, so you can do your gathering stitches from upper edge to lower edge. All right, and 2 rows again, one at 1/2 inch and one at a 1/4 inch. All right, so now that your gathering stitches are complete, we're going to pull the bobbin threads, so the ones on the wrong side of the piece, pull them up to create those lovely gathers on the vertical sides of your ruched panel piece. So right now I'm just kind of guesstimating how much they need to be gathered, but what you can do is grab your stay piece and use it as a guide for how tightly that piece needs to be gathered, because these two pieces are going to fit together perfectly around the outer edges once your gathers are completed. All right, so I'm going to do my gathers on the opposite side. And now I'm just matching my edges from the ruched panel piece to the ruched panel stay. And I'm starting to pin them, matching the edges and distributing the gathers so that they look nice and neat. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Distribute those gathers just using, I like to use the tips of my fingernails and just redistribute them so that they look nice and even. And now we're going to match the remaining edges of these two pieces. And in case you missed it, these two pieces are both right sides up, okay? So you have the right side of the stay facing the wrong side of the ruched panel. And just continue pinning all the way around, all 4 sides, so that the raw edges match perfectly. I'm pinning the upper edge of the pieces together. That's just a nice straight line. And now I'm going to pin the lower edge. Okay, now we're going to baste these edges together as I've pinned them using a zigzag stitch and using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. As you can see, I am zigzagging these gathers in place, which will help control them when we go to sew the seams in the subsequent steps. So continue zigzagging all the way around all 4 edges that you pinned, pivoting at the corners. Okay, so now you can see that I have basted the 2 layers together, and this now forms one single piece. So we're just going to treat this like one piece. Now grab your front and back panty, the ruched panty pieces, and we're going to sew these seams. So pin the ruched side panel to the panty front, matching any notches and the top and bottom edges of that piece. Okay, we're going to sew this seam using a zigzag stitch and a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And these layers get a little bit thick because you have those gathers, but we can trim those down after sewing. I'm trimming the seam allowances down to about a 1/4 inch. If you have a serger, this would be a nice place to then finish these seam allowances together as one. Or you could zigzag them together on your sewing machine, but it's not necessary because they're not going to fray. It can just give you a neater finish if you prefer that. Okay, so now we're going to do the back seam. So sew the ruched side panel to the panty back panel, again, matching your raw edges, making sure to match any notches and circles. And then we're just going to repeat that process of sewing that seam at 5/8 of an inch. Repeat the same process of trimming the seam allowances. And now we have an almost completed panty, but we need to finish the crotch and the legs. So we're going to start with the leg elastic. Okay, the first thing you're going to do is cut 2 lengths of elastic for the legs, following the measurements in the instructions. Then you're going to fold each piece of elastic in half and place a pin at the center mark. Now, the next thing we're doing is finding the center point of the leg to match the elastic to. Now, when I recorded this video, I don't think I had the notch that you guys are going to have on the pattern. So what I'm doing here is just folding the leg in half to find the halfway point. But your pattern will have a nice little notch where the side seam would be if this bottom had a side seam to match the center point of your elastic to. And the first thing we're going to do is sew the elastic to the leg using a wide zigzag stitch. So you can go up to as wide as 4 millimeters, and you're matching the elastic edge to the raw edge of the leg. And you're stretching the elastic to match the leg itself. So just zigzag right down the center of that 3/8 of an inch wide swimwear elastic. Now we're going to turn the elastic into the wrong side, and we're going to do a narrow zigzag, so about 2.5 wide by 2.5 long, and zigzag over the edge of the elastic. You should be zigzagging 3/8 of an inch from the folded edge. So just keep turning in the elastic to the wrong side of the panty as you go, and zigzag stitch, centering that zigzag stitch over the edge of the elastic. All right, you can see how lovely that finished edge of the leg looks. And the next thing we're going to do is repeat the whole process on the other side. Same exact steps. You're going to apply the elastic to the panty leg. Okay, now that you have finished your second leg elastic, we can sew our crotch seam. So turn the panty wrong side out and put the front crotch together with the back crotch and match the folded edges and pin them together. Now sew the crotch seam at 5/8 of an inch using a narrow zigzag. And Now we're going to finger press this seam open and top stitch either side at 1/4 inch. So on the first side of the seam line, I'm going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance and top stitch in place, back stitching at either end, and just making sure that my seam allowances stay open underneath. Now repeat the same thing on the opposite side of the seam line. And now we're going to trim those seam allowances on the back for a nice flat finish. So just trim away any excess threads, and now we are going to trim away those excess seam allowances from the crotch seam, and that will give you a nice flat finish. Okay, your ruched panty is now complete, and look how cute it looks.